Thanks, Olympia, and welcome and good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here, and it's my pleasure to be your guest speaker this afternoon. And I think we have about an hour, and so what I wanted to really talk about is what we see happening from the world of green buildings and green planning and sustainable design. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are really things that you're already familiar with. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to have a bit of a conversation about what we see as certainly where we've been in terms of planning cities, where we are today, both in Edmonton, in the National Capital Region, and around the world. And where we see the emerging trends in terms of sustainable design and sustainable urban development. So that's really an overview of what I want to talk about, and hopefully we'll have enough time to have a discussion, have a conversation, and ask some questions. It's interesting to be here at the beginning of 2014. I'm still shaking my head about how it got to be 2014. Somehow those years have snuck up on us. But you know, when we first started working on sustainable design, we were still back in the 20th century. And back in ancient history, a long time ago in the 20th century, we used to talk about, you know, design very much around, you know, sort of individual objects, around design as being around sort of unique and siloed artifacts. And I think that was sort of true at the urban scale too, not just in terms of art and architecture and furniture, but also at the urban scale. You know, we, of course, some of us are old enough to remember things like the JETSONS, right? And back in those days, there was this idea that, you know, we could all live in bubbles, separated from our physical environment, apart from nature, and that the world of the future was disconnected from, actually, from planet Earth, as you can see. So we really didn't have a whole lot of interest in our planet. And in fact, the car was at the center. So, of course, what's wonderful about being in a car is you can be in your own bubble and separate yourself from your community, from people around you, and from nature. And so the car, of course, became the paradigm of the 20th century planning. And a lot of what was in cities from previous generations, like the image from Montreal, where I grew up, on the right, cities that were connected to the street, urban housing that was connected to the street, kind of got lost, right? When we decided that cars were at the forefront, we had to have room for a lot more parking and all those garages and everything, and we couldn't do cities that looked like that anymore, because that just wasn't going to be modern, was it? Of course, at that point in the sort of latter part of the 20th century, cities were not considered to be livable. In fact, even early in the 20th century, I mean, if you read, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright's books about garden cities and about moving out to Oak Park, if you actually read the text, it's kind of scary in today's world, because as much as many of us admire Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural work and his attitude towards organic architecture, it was very much about removing oneself from urban life. And it was very much about that the quality of life was going to be healthier, more sustainable, more beautiful out in suburbia, and that the cities were kind of ugly, dirty, noisy, smelly places for people who couldn't afford the beauty of living out in nature. And so it's kind of interesting how much that has tipped on its head. And that here we are sort of rapidly starting into the second decade of the 21st century. And we're starting to talk more and more about integration, about connecting people, connecting community, connecting transportation, going back to all of the things that sort of got forgotten at the end of the 20th century. So it's interesting to sort of watch that trajectory and see what's happened. A couple of interesting things have happened. Certainly the conversation around sustainable design, both at the building scale and at the urban scale, really started in earnest in the early 90s. So, you know, 20 years after the first energy crisis, around the time of the first Rideau conference, right? And so, of course, many of you know that we've just had the anniversary, 20th anniversary of that Rideau conference, and you can see how much the conversation has changed. partly because I think our communities are much more educated than they were back in the 1950s. People in our communities are paying attention, they're reading a lot more, they have access to better information. They're not waiting for you to send them in the mail what's happening this week in their community. They're going to find that out through their own sources on their own Twitter feed, and thank you very much, you don't need to put a notice in their mailbox. So a lot of information is moving very quickly, people are paying attention, and the engagement is becoming palpable. Just yesterday, there was an event here in the city. Some of you may have participated in it. It was called Building Communities That Create Health. Was anybody there at that event? No? Well, it was just over here at Lister Hall yesterday, and there were many planners and designers and public and private sector folks there, and the conversation was actually, or the room was convened by the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And it was about sustainable communities. So what's happening today, I think, is really important, and that's that the connections between the quality of life in our cities, the shape of our cities, and public health are coming into the forefront. And that puts the discussion around urban design in a very different plane. As soon as we're talking about health and health issues and health care and the cost of health care and reducing that cost, all of a sudden we end up in a very different conversation. At the same time, we're starting to see more political will from a whole bunch of sources, and things like Lead for Neighbourhood Development that came out in 2009 after many years of development. And some of you are pretty familiar with that document and with what's happening in the world of Lead and neighbourhood development. Has anybody been involved with the project that's Lead ND project yet? And I don't even know if anybody in Edmonton is doing one yet, but certainly that conversation has been around since 2009. In fact, I think Jolie and I presented to this group back in 2010 when that document first came out to talk about what LEAD might mean in terms of the nitty-gritty of integrating planning and design. And today I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty. Today I want to talk more about the ideas and the initiatives that we see that are all converging. So, say at this point, we're really focused on what is happening today in the world of sustainable communities. I heard you say that there's a Walkable Communities event coming up. There's a lot of focus on changing the way we think about our community development. And in the National Capital Region, we're also seeing some of the same things. When I first joined the National Capital Commission's Advisory Committee on Design, which is chaired by Larry Beasley, a planner who's probably well known to most of you, it was really the idea, the conversation around sustainability in the National Capital and in the City of Ottawa was really still in its infancy. And it's moved along a great deal in the last 6 or so years that I've been involved. And just this year, this document was produced. You can find it online. It's called Building a Greener Capital. And there's a whole lot of initiatives around greening the capital region in parallel with work that's being done by the City of Ottawa, work that's being done by the Government of Ontario. And in many ways, Olympia sort of threw down the gauntlet and say, how can our capital be as green and as sustainable and as beautiful as the national capital is becoming? And I know that we're hearing from our municipal leadership that there is an appetite for moving in that direction. We have that opportunity, and I think all of you in the room can be part of that solution. So a couple of things that we're seeing that are in the moment kind of being implemented both in national capital and in cities around the world that are affecting not just sustainability, but also the integration of design and planning. And I think those are the two sort of themes that I want to raise today, is that, at some point in history, sort of architecture design, urban design, and planning kind of went in divergent directions. And I think we're coming to a time when those conversations are coming back together. So even simple things like design on a human scale, and these are things that we pay attention to all over the world. but they're paid attention to a great deal at the National Capital Commission. When we review design, we're actually looking for those kind of levels of detail where people are, where design teams are actually bringing forward interface between the built environment and the public realm. And that level of detail is being attended to. It's not just the big picture, the conceptual strategies, but it is the detail. Obviously, we're in a winter city, and there's a lot of discussion happening here about winter cities, and I know there's a winter cities conference being planned again here in Edmonton after a hiatus of a good number of years. And in Ottawa, we're also talking about winter cities, and in fact, one of the projects that we've been reviewing recently is the new transit system for the City of Ottawa. They went through a very, very rigorous process where our committee reviewed the designs a number of times for each of the transit stations and for their location and their interface with the urban environment around before it went forward. And even though it is being done, the project is being done as a very large public-private partnership, still the attention to design was very, very rigorous through the original planning stage. So this drawing was actually from my good friends at Busby, Perkins and Will, who were the designers of the first phase of the project. So they were the bridging consultants that worked for the City of Ottawa and designed all the stations before the P3 competition took place. And this image is one of the ones that I particularly like because it really shows how, you know, the Rideau Canal and the design of the street and the transit system really integrate in a winter setting. And so one of the things actually that we always ask for at ACBDAR is that whenever proponents come forward, they have to come forward with some discussion about winter and what our climate, how that influences the urban environment in our city. The other thing that we're seeing a lot more of, not just in Ottawa, but in other cities, is this image, which is from Vancouver. But you know, there's discussions happening here about urban infill and the IDEA group, right? The Urban Infill Design Edmonton Association, right? Anybody involved with that group? Right? A few people here. Yeah, there's a few people in my office as well who are quite actively involved, and a few other friends of ours. But you know, these are kinds of examples where, you know, we still, strangely enough, and I'm puzzled by this. But we still see big box development here in Edmonton. I mean, how is that possible? But in other cities, that's not happening anymore, not just big boxes all by themselves. Sure, big boxes, you need retail, of course, everybody wants retail, but what are you putting on top of it, right? So in Vancouver, there's housing on top of the big boxes. And other cities are going in that direction where the idea of just freestanding retail is shifting to something that creates a more vibrant, urban, less car-focused, more pedestrian-focused city. Now, these are not things that are new to you, but I love this one. I go to the 104th Street Farmers Market all the time, and maybe some of you do as well. It's in my neighborhood. And of course, in the wintertime, it moves over to City Hall. And last week, no, the week before, I was there, and the fellow who sells, Dan who sells the bison, you know Dan, he's a great guy, he was so excited. He said, "Did you see we were in National Geographic?" And I went, "Really? We were in National Geographic?" He says, "Yeah, our market, it was considered to be like the best market in the world by this guy, this blogger who writes for National Geographic." And this was all over the media. I missed it entirely, but some of you may have caught this. But it's so fun to have Edmonton's farmers market be seen to be the best farmers market in the world, according to this one journalist. And I think that idea that you can have sort of vibrant outdoor spaces, markets that are noticed worldwide and that draw attention to our city, but also create a place for us to buy healthy food, is quite delightful and quite fun to see that happening in Edmonton. I go to the market with my little trolley thing every Saturday morning in the summertime, and had some friends over a few weeks ago, and they said, "So you live in this downtown place here, so like, where do you get your groceries?" And I went, "You know, see that little trolley thing sitting in the corner? That's how I get my groceries." And they went, "Wow, really? You actually do that?" I said, You can in Edmonton, of course. And so we're becoming, that kind of lifestyle choice is becoming more available to us. And obviously, the more we have people that have those choices, the easier it becomes to live a sustainable, to create sustainable communities. The more we can reduce our environmental impact. And we need our planning frameworks to enable this kind of thing. You know, I mean, I was stunned a couple of years ago where I think it was one of the restaurants around the corner from me, it might have been Tres Carnales or someplace like that, that was trying to get a permit to put their tables out on their sidewalk, and it took them 2 years to get a permit to put their tables on their sidewalk. It's like, really? Like, how is that a sustainable city when we can't get tables out on the sidewalk? And so there are a lot of things here in our municipal approaches to things that really don't support the kind of green development and green lifestyle that I think we are heading towards. So I think there's opportunities to improve how we do things at every level, at the municipal level, and how we approach planning and design and how it integrates. So I don't know, I grew up in Montreal, and tables on the sidewalk, I don't think you get permits for those. You just stick your tables on the sidewalk. Who needs a permit? Like, what? You know? So I remember a few people in my office actually went, there was like a sit-in on Rice Howard Way because they weren't allowed to have tables on the sidewalk. I don't know. Anyways, I think we also have heard a lot of discussion over the last years, and these are all connected conversations. There's a lot of discussions been taking place across North America, including, you know, books by Richard Florida and others, talking about creative cities and how cities that are vibrant attract and retain talent, and how cities that attract and retain talent are vibrant, right? And I mean, I remember years ago we were working on Intuit's new headquarters, and we said to them, you know, what's the challenge about running a headquarters in Edmonton? And they said, basically, the city's not vibrant enough. We have a hard time attracting talent. People don't want to come here because it's not a great downtown. So that's shifting, and we're excited about that. This image is actually from Ottawa. And although this isn't a downtown facility, it does demonstrate the same idea, which is, this is actually the communication security establishment. So it's like one of those super hyper secure facilities for, like, this is like the NSA of Canada, right? It is actually, I'm not joking, it actually is. We actually, one of our tasks at the National Capital Commission is to review all the designs for all the buildings that are built in the national interest. And so anything that's of federal property, we get to see it. And so we reviewed this building a few times. And in fact, it was also you know, designed as a sort of a competition process. But the fact that, you know, we, as a design review panel, had input into the quality of environment that they created for basically the most talented, brightest minds in the country or in the world that they're attracting to this place. This is a facility that's designed for about 2,500 people. So it's a very large building. And it's very, very secure. We actually got to tour the site, which was kind of fun, while it's still on the construction site. I've never been on a construction site before where you had to go through metal detectors to get actually onto the site. It was wild. It was like, there's lots of things that we've been hearing for years about sites that can be redeveloped and can be intensified. And I think in Edmonton we have that opportunity, in Alberta we have that opportunity to look at, you know, how do we reimagine neighborhoods? How do we reimagine communities? How do we create ways that our cities can create more housing in the same amount of space, more of everything in the same amount of space, and at the same time improving the quality of life? Another example from Ottawa, a kind of a really nice redevelopment that's been happening very recently at the Rideau Centre, which, if any of you have ever gone to Ottawa, it's right by the market, and it's kind of a rundown shopping mall that doesn't look like much. It's very inward looking, very 70s, and they've completely reimagined it to make it more street focused. And they also came and presented to ACPDAR. So, you know, the fact that each of these projects comes and has to kind of have that conversation with a committee of architects and planners from across the country raises the bar on how sustainable and how street related and how durable and how enduring these buildings become. So they're not just commercial enterprises. Around the world, you know, this one's a trick one. Who knows where this picture is taken? This is Istanbul. And actually, this square, Taksim Square, was in the news about a year ago when there were riots in Taksim Square. You know, the idea that our cities really have breathing space, right? That there's room for everybody in our urban environments. And of course, that there's active space. So this is quite obviously the Rideau Canal. No question that this has been around for a long time. And, you know, we could do stuff like that around here too, right? We could have a lot more active outdoor spaces in our urban environment. It wouldn't be that difficult to do that. Speaking of transportation, of course, everybody talks about walkable communities and transit-oriented development. And again, another image from the Ottawa projects of the transit system. And just to sort of look at the quality of design and the quality of material. So the interesting piece about this is not necessarily just the image, but the interesting piece is that the integration between planning at a large scale, at a transit system scale, all the way down to the attention to the detail and the quality of materials is all within all of our concern. So it's not just, you know, this is planning and this is architecture and this is engineering and this is construction. It becomes much more interactive as a conversation. And I think that's what we see as emerging trends. The other thing that we see as an emerging trend is infill development, but also reusing existing buildings. And I think that's also important from a design and construction perspective, but it's incredibly important from a planning perspective. The greenest building in the world is the building that already exists. That's well proven. In other words, if you have embodied energy, if you have embodied resources, and if you can figure out how to not tear that down and how to repurpose that, you dramatically reduce your environmental impact of your built environment. And at the same time, we green our buildings by creating cultural history as well. So it's not just environmental, it's not just energy, it's not just resources, but it's also the history and the culture of our communities. And of course, art and culture, speaking of art and culture, is always an important part of keeping cities vital and cities energized. So this image I took when I was at Nuits Blanche in Toronto back in October, and I particularly like how it sort of frames Toronto City Hall. But this sculpture was pretty amazing. It was made out of a whole bunch of bicycles, like thousands of bicycles. And so, you know, the artist was sort of talking about urban transportation, but in a sort of artistic frame. And it was a pretty remarkable sculpture. And speaking of bicycling, of course, wherever you go in the world, you see more and more emphasis on bicycle transportation. These images are actually from Bogota, from Colombia. And we were there just over Christmas. And every Sunday in Bogota, they have a thing called ciclovia. This would be fun to do here. Ciclovia is basically they close down a major thoroughfare. It'd be sort of like closing down Jasper Avenue from, you know, 82nd Street all the way to 170th Street. Like it's a big, long thoroughfare, you know, Jasper Avenue and Stony Plain Road or something. And it's just bikes and pedestrians just every Sunday from 7 in the morning till 7 at night every Sunday. So it's really cool. Everybody knows that that's what it is, and all the cab drivers work their way around it, and all the buses get rerouted, and this is a really busy road all the rest of the time, but that shuts down on Sunday. So, you know, there's lots of cool ideas and that have, and actually ciclovia, I think, takes place in a lot of cities. I don't. New York has it. Ottawa. And Ottawa. Long Beach as well. Oh wow, cool. So, and I don't even know where it actually started, whether it started in Bogota or started somewhere in South America, or it started someplace else, but it's been going for a good number of years, and we rented bikes and out we went. It was very fun. That's my husband there in the corner with on his bike. Other things that are currently happening, again, infill development, new development. This is a very current project that is still very much under wraps. So all we know about it so far is that the old Domtar lands in the middle of Ottawa have been secured, and there's public consultation taking place right now, and our friends at Windmill Development are planning a very green, very sustainable community of a fairly substantial scale. I mean, not quite the scale of our airport lands here, but pretty large. So interesting to see that kind of really focused green development starting to happen in the hearts of our cities, whether it is, you know, here in Edmonton or whether it is in Ottawa. So I think those are the things that we're seeing that are today. And I think that's interesting to frame that as today, because to some people are still saying, well, that's a long ways in the future. Some of these ideas are still a long ways in the future. And they're not. They're happening today. They just could be happening today in more places. And so we could apply a lot of those lessons from other cities. We could make green development easier in Edmonton. We could close down Jasper Avenue and have Ciclovia. Like, those aren't hard things to do, right? They're not expensive. They don't require huge legislative changes. They're relatively easy to do. And so those are the kinds of tips we can pick up from the world. And then I just want to talk a little bit about what I see as emerging trends that aren't really happening yet, but they're about to happen or starting to be on the verge of happening in the conversation around sustainable communities all over the world. Again, the idea of integrating communities, the idea of having a lot more live, work, play, right? The idea of having a lot more making use of the sun. So a lot more energy focus as we move forward. You know, we've been doing buildings. I mean, actually, the building on the left there is actually the Government of Canada building in Yellowknife. That was opened in 2005, so almost 10 years ago. And it was pretty much the largest photovoltaic installation in Western Canada. We've now just opened the new Environment Canada offices here in Edmonton, and they have a much bigger photovoltaic installation. And you know, we're working towards net zero buildings. In fact, a study recently, this was actually Johnson Controls. They have they call it energy efficiency indicator, global indicator study. And in their study, they talked about that the demand in the market that they researched around major corporations around the world is to see many more net zero buildings, many more net zero communities, many more green leases, green office spaces, right? And so from a planning perspective, I think what we want to look at is how can we make those things easier? You know, how can we make it less challenging to create, you know, a net zero office building? Well, if we want to do a net zero office building here in Edmonton, we still have to provide so much parking that it kind of obviates the whole point. It'd be great if there was flexibility so you didn't have to do that, right? And we're not there yet, right? Our communities aren't there yet. The other thing we're seeing an emerging trend of is this agriburbia. And I think this is quite cool. There's a group of people outside of Denver, Colorado that have coined this term, agriburbia. And they basically created an enterprise where they create urban agriculture in the suburbs. And it's occurred to some of us that the future of our suburbs is actually agriculture. They're going to become farms because people won't be able to live out there anymore. And so the future of life in the city is going to be in the city, and all these suburbs that are being developed are eventually going to have to be turned back into agriculture, but a different kind of agriculture. So these guys have started that trend already, where they're actually contracting with people, and there are various variations of this going on all over North America. But this one's in Denver, Colorado, which is rather a cold place. And the idea that, you know, fresh local food is grown in people's yards and on people's acreages and on vacant lots and on schoolyards and all sorts of other land that's out there in the suburbs that's underutilized. And that's really starting to change the conversation about the interface between the city and the surrounding region. The other thing we're seeing is that the demand for green engineering. But the integration of planning, design, and engineering, the idea of getting rid of pipes and integrating how we move water and energy through our communities in a much more sustainable way is a very real part of the conversation. And it'd be great to see, a lot more discussion between the engineering community, the planning community, the architectural community, and the construction community around how we can more effectively make use of the infrastructure that we have to reduce its impact on the environment and to reduce costs. And there's some beautiful examples all over the world, right? Just really nice examples of green space and water collection systems that are integrated. This one is in Houston, and they've got this beautiful kind of garden green space water collection system that all works together in the heart of the city. And in fact, we're seeing large organizations like the Urban Land Institute starting to talk about integrating climate change. And that's interesting because they haven't been talking about that for a very long time. But this is actually from 2013 when Obama's State of the Union address was talking about climate change, and the president of the Urban Land Institute comes back and says, yes, we have to integrate greener cities, we have to pay attention to climate change. So I think what we're seeing is that the sort of convergence of integration or reintegration, I guess, between planning and design, between architecture and urbanism, between engineering and planning, all of these ideas starting to come together in such a way that maybe we need to rethink what the rules are that we work within, so that we make those rules a bit more adaptable to those overlaps between our various disciplines. And a lot of that can come out of thinking about how we achieve better environmental function, how we can work together as planners and developers, and there's really neat examples all over the world that we've seen. And ultimately, if we're going to achieve sustainable communities, it has to be done in a way that's also affordable for people, right? So affordable for people to develop and affordable for people to live. And I think that that's the future that we see, is that urban lifestyles are going to become a lot more affordable. And the way we're going to do that is by engaging the community. And we've been doing that for a long time, but I think it's not just about architects, it's about all of us working together. I mean, this is a project that actually Jolie was involved with. This was the East Edmonton Primary Care Center, and we had a great deal of challenge. It was a public facility, right? Primary care facility, but we had a great deal of challenge in getting the community to align its vision with the vision of Alberta Health Services. And ultimately, by integrating green space onto the site, by retaining the trees, by retaining a historic building on the site, we were able to meet the community's needs as well as the needs of Alberta Health Services to create a functioning emergency services facility. And that's working really well. And so engaging the community is something that I think we all can do a lot more of if we're focused on designing sustainably, designing lead communities, very much about engaging people in the process. So just to kind of wrap up, I think what we want to say is that when we're thinking about sustainable communities, I think what we want to think about is all of the aspects of our environment. We want to think about water and how we use water, and water is maybe the new energy. Some people are saying that water is going to become a lot scarcer than energy. Energy is in fact really abundant on the earth. We have no shortage of solar income. We just don't have a great means of capturing it yet, but we're working on that. And finally, I think whatever we are doing as planners, as architects, as designers, using the tools that are at our disposal to think about how we live on this planet, because so far we haven't found another one, I don't think. At least I haven't found one last I checked. So far we're just on this one planet, so we got to kind of think about how we're living on this planet. So that's really in a nutshell an overview of some of the thoughts we have around what's happening in the world of sustainable development.